After successfully completing two very important sections discussing JavaScript advanced features, in this section, we will address the elephant in the room. The last few years, there have been tremendous attempts by the JavaScript community to make asynchronous tasks easier. There are actually 4 ways to deal with asynchronous code in JavaScript, and we are going to study 3 of them. Beginning with callbacks and how to simplify what has ended up being called the callback hell. JSON Placeholder is an online service that allows us to hit RESTful endpoints that produce real life-like data. We have an endpoint that returns a list of users along with several useful information like the company they're working for and their home address. Then we have a list of posts made by those users. Notice that each post has a user ID, so we can associate every user we fetch using the user's endpoint with post that can be found here. So we are going to build this simple logic using async.js. Async.js is a library that preceded promises and async await and helped us structure a callback-based logic without resulting in a callback hell. Async.js consists of some functions like each series, and each of series. Now, every method is a bit different, but what they do most of the time is that they streamline the callback hell. So instead of nesting callbacks, they inverse the logic. They assume the responsibility of calling those callbacks so that you end up writing code that looks a bit more synchronous than it actually is. It can't be compared with promises or async await, but it is useful for cases when you're stuck with an older version of either Node or a browser. Perhaps you still need to support older versions of Internet Explorer and you can't use the latest new features and you don't want to transpile your code. So there you go. We are going to require the request HTTP client. Now, usually I prefer to use Axios that supports promises, but since we are going to restrict ourselves to only using callbacks in this video, let's see how we can do it with request, which is the easiest HTTP client that comes with Node out of the box. I'm going to perform a request to the user's endpoint, fetch the users. If an error happens, traditionally we're going to use the callback that accepts the first argument is the error object, the second is the data. There you go. We got the users. Let's test this logic. Let's pass a callback to the getUsers function and print the users to the console window. And we get this whole list of users exactly like we saw in the browser a few minutes ago. So the next step will be to fetch the posts. But JSON Placeholder only allows us to fetch the whole list of users and all of the posts. This means that we need to fetch the posts, filter them, and assign them to users. Let's begin by decoupling the code responsible for fetching the whole list of posts into a separate call. So request followed by the specified path and a callback. Within that, we can make a check for the error and then go ahead and use the callback to provide the error and the data. So if you notice that we are kind of repeating ourselves, this is because what we're essentially doing is we are adding a filter that checks for errors and then returns the response body, only this time to map the post to the user. So this is it. We only want to receive the posts that correspond to the past user ID. So now we need to call getUsers, and then for each of the users found in the resulting array, we need to make that many calls, asynchronous calls to the JSON Placeholder API, and only fetch the posts that correspond to that user. With just callbacks, this is something that would require at least 2 levels of the callback hell. We need to go at least 2 levels deep, maybe more. So let's see how async.js can make our lives easier and reduce that level of nested callbacks, that depth of the required callbacks that we need in order to get what we want, which is a list of users along with their posts. So async.series is a way to tell the runtime that we want to run an array of functions that use callbacks in quick succession. There you go, the first one, and after this one is finished, we can go ahead and call the next one. So this is where we use getUsers and we pass a callback. We are already on a second level of callbacks, although this isn't very evident since it doesn't seem like the code is moving to the right, because the way we structure the async series call makes it seem like the code is kind of synchronous. I mean, if you omit the async.series and the callback with the arrow, it is like this is just effortlessly. The problem when using callbacks, and this is also a problem when using promises, is that sometimes you may need to create a state object to temporarily store results of calls and operations that return callbacks. So now that we have the users, we can use each of series to iterate over every user and execute a specific function. Now this is sequential. I mean, we will fetch the posts for the first user, then wait until we get a response back, and then move on to the second user. This is the power of async.js. If you had to do that without the use of this library, it would have been hard to manufacture this logic on your own. It would require at least 4 or maybe 5 levels of a callback pyramid. So there you have, each of series runs this code for every user and only moves on to the next one after what we place in these lines of code finishes. So what we want to do at this point is fetch the user's posts. So we provide the user ID, and upon return we set the posts into the user object. Always make sure to check for errors. If one of these operations fails, then all of them fail. If for some reason the attempt to fetch the second user's posts fails, then we stop there. No more fetching for any other user. The operation has failed. Of course, you can control that. If you don't want to do that, perhaps you, instead of calling the operation callback with the error object, perhaps you log something. You log that you were unable to find the posts, and then you resume. Finally, the eachSeries method has a global callback that we can check for an error. Now this error may have originated from any of the above functions. So if you want to know exactly where it originated from and maintain stack trace, you need to be more creative with it because it doesn't come out of the box. This is one of the side effects, and it always was a disadvantage when working with callbacks. We're going to solve that in the next videos when we're going to introduce promises that maintain stack trace if they're applied correctly and async await.